All right, so this is the outline of the lecture. We're going to be talking about pretty much how the overexploitation of resources continues due to colonial powers. We're going to be looking at the origins of a few national parks and other protected areas, the first couple few ones that happen. We're going to be looking at three kind of conventions slash conferences that occurred in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and how they were trying to sort of get everybody together, all the colonial powers, and basically stop these declines in mostly wildlife. But I know that resources like forestry was also important for them as well. And then we're going to look at the birth of a couple of NGOs, just two, because it turns out that most of the NGOs that we know of that are really important in conservation, like WWF and Conservation International, they didn't start until like the 60s and 70s, which actually kind of makes sense if you think about it. That was when, after, what do you call it, Silent Spring happened and the whole Earth movement was going on. So it seems that that would be a good time for them to start popping up. So just as a reminder, since it's been 2 weeks since we talked about this whole overexploitation of resources, just again, the takeaways from the last lecture that I gave, colonialism being pushed by this need for new markets and also the raw materials to make things and then sell to these new markets, basically as a way to make money, and also as material for industrialization in the colonial powers country. And then we're looking at environmental degradation and destruction happening mostly due to conversion of natural habitats into plantations for cash crops. So for Africa, we have things like ivory, palm oil, coffee, sisal, rubber, and golden diamonds, all of this stuff which requires either killing animals or destroying natural habitat. There's also people, which is awful on its own. Then in South America, we have gold and silver, mostly citrus orchards, coffee, cotton, cocoa, and cane sugar. And then ranches were a big thing as well for beef and goats and sheep. And again, all this requires conversion of natural resources. For North America, hopefully we'll be hearing something about that, not next week, but the week after that, from a couple of you guys. I know that one of you guys is doing beavers. So for North America, cash crops were mainly furs and timbers, but we also have things like cane sugar and tobacco and cotton. And then for South and Southeast Asia, we have things, a lot of spices, peppermint, cinnamon, cloves, and then cotton again, opium, tea, and teak, and indigo. And again, all of this is being, all of this is converting natural habitat, planting these crops, taking these crops out of the colonial countries and exporting them back to the actual country of origin. So Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, etc. Like you guys saw in that documentary, King Leopold's Ghost. And then selling it to either other colonies that the country has or selling it to European countries and looking to make a profit. So it doesn't take long for people to notice that things are sort of running out. So in 1492, post 1492, with Columbus running into the Caribbean and Spain sort of following after that, we see deforestation of these Caribbean islands, and this leads to awareness, obviously, that, yeah, we can kill a lot of people, we can decimate populations, and then we can also destroy forest cover. And on its own, like little tangent, Japan at this time was completely isolated. They didn't allow outsiders into the island. So on its own little tangent, Japan was dealing with deforestation of its own. And it turns out that the shogunate, the ruler at that time, sort of made these forest policies, uh, management and conservation policies, which helped with reversing that deforestation. They were pretty close to like ecological collapse, but they were able to reverse it and reforest things. And it seems that there was like a lot of local movement when it came to that, and there was integration of forests into human life. So it was like a patchwork of villages and then forests, and these policies were called Satayama. But I just thought that would be interesting to look at in the 1600s. Japan's facing this issue and then deals with it very well. So this is just a quote from a historical reading that I got while I was Googling. And we have this person on Mauritius, which is a small island off the east coast of Africa, southeast coast of Africa. It's right by Madagascar. And already they're seeing that, these deforestation, the logging of the timber, happening on this island is causing a lot of problems. And, this guy is saying that, you need to study the forest, you need to exploit and use them in the most economical way possible, and only allow people to cut them if they ensure their conservation. And obviously, at all these little islands, we're seeing deforestation. At all these little at these plantations, we're seeing deforestation, and we're seeing climate changes that are sort of happening alongside or due to this deforestation. So less rain. This guy was talking about how if you take out the forest on this island, there'll be less rain. There'll be more soil erosion, and it'll be a lot harder for the island to make a profit. So we're seeing forest policies, forest management and conservation policies spreading throughout colonies in South Asia. And again, this was mostly so that the colonies could still be making a profit. So first protected areas. The first legally protected area, now obviously we've been talking about sacred sites, sacred forests, shrines and stuff. So obviously these aren't the first protected areas, but they're the first, legally written down, I suppose, protected areas in the world. We have Mainridge Reserve on Tobago, which is an island in the Caribbean, and it was this ridge of forest, like the island's sort of mountainous near the center. So the forest on those mountains was conserved and protected to protect the climate for sugarcane plantations that were happening on the lowland. And it's kind of funny because they probably wouldn't have been able to cut down the forest anyway, since the terrain was really rugged, but it was protected, and it was protected for protecting the sugarcane plantations. 1778, we have Balkan Ul National Park in Mongolia, which was set aside by the locals for its beauty. I looked a bit more into that, and it seems that this holy man used the mountain as a place to meditate, kind of like with Buddha and the tree. And so the locals, like hundreds and hundreds of years before it was even protected, the locals wouldn't hunt on the mountain, and they wouldn't cut down any forest on the mountain, because this holy man that they revered so heavily had used that mountain as a place to sort of reach enlightenment. So we have that happening in 1778. And then in 1872, we have Yellowstone National Park, which we all know of. The reason that it was set aside was not for any conservation purposes. It was set aside because the people who did the expeditions, one of which was this financial backer for a railroad, I think it was North Pacific Railroad. they suggested that the region could be America's Switzerland. So instead of Americans going across the seas and spending money in Switzerland to see the natural wonders there, they could just take a train, obviously, to Yellowstone and see the natural wonders there, and sort of American money could stay within borders. Of course, there were indigenous people on this land, and the Nez Perce, the Crow, and the Shoshone tribes were displaced and killed by the US Army. Treaties were written and then obviously discarded, and yeah, so the US stole this land. All right, so we go to Australia. We have a Royal National Park, which was set aside for the health of a nearby city and also the naturalization of exotic game animals. I totally forgot the name of the guy who really pushed it. I don't think it really matters. But this guy who was a third generation Australian was really, really concerned about the pollution that was occurring in the city. And he wanted to make sure that children had like clean air. And so he thought that they should set aside this region, which would become Royal National Park. It was on land that, of course, it was on land that people wouldn't have been able to cultivate for sugarcane or any other cash crops anyway. So again, we have that sort of sense of, you know, it's not really, you're not really losing anything. But he thought that they should put that area aside and keep the forest there and the natural habitat there to sort of keep the air clean. Because by now we have that idea of if you cut down forests, your climate changes and you get more pollution, soil erosion, and less rain and stuff like that. And then also they were interested in bringing in probably British wildlife like stags and stuff like that to hunt. And so they needed like a holding place for these animals to become acclimated to the climate. So they thought that that would be also be a good place to have that happen. So indigenous aboriginals had been chased off and killed, massacred basically, on that land in 1861, so less than 20 years beforehand. So they were gone. In Canada, we have Banff and Yoho National Parks, and just like Yellowstone National Park, it was these places started off as they wanted them to be tourist attractions connected to a railroad. So one place started off as a stop for tourists. It was like a what do you call it? A restaurant at the bottom of a mountain, so that the train wouldn't have to go over the mountain for some reason. Another place started off as just like a house that tourists could stay at, and it was near a lake. Indigenous people that were taken off this land, I'm not even trying to pronounce that, Siska, Stony Nakota, and the Cree, and a lot of others were displaced. And then we come to New Zealand, and here we have, if you guys saw the lecture I gave at David Miller's wildlife management class, what happened was that the British wanted to use this sacred mountain as a place to raise sheep, and obviously the indigenous Maori didn't want a sacred mountain to become a place to raise sheep. So the chief gifted the lands to the British Crown in exchange for protecting that area from anything like a sheep run fate. And it turns out that the British actually followed up on their promises, and so they didn't turn it into a place to raise sheep, and so that place was protected. So we have, again, still, even though there are beginnings of places being set aside for whatever reason, and being protected, we still have continued overexploitation and resource decline. And really, it was the loss of huntable game that really started causing alarm bells to start ringing. And the thing is that it wasn't just hunters that were doing this, it was naturalists for the most part in zoos. So, sorry, my throat. So, I mentioned before about the primate trade that was happening. The Portuguese catching Brazilian monkeys and trading them off, and how 20 species across the world, or at least 20 species across the world, were being traded in the exotic animal trade, and how gorillas were being shipped to Liverpool for zoos. Well, this is happening across the world, as mentioned before. And as mentioned before, there were huge mortality rates in shipping these animals. So obviously, I mean, often you would have like 20 animals in the hold of a ship, and you would be lucky to get one that comes out at the end of the whole trip. Um, and these are just a couple of numbers that I got from other papers and reading some accounts. So we have 728 gorillas, individual gorillas in British museum collections today. Those are all gorillas that had to be taken out of Africa, obviously, to be put into these museums. And if you remember that short talk I gave you guys as an example for your presentations in 2 weeks, you'll remember that the Virunga gorilla population is like something like 690. So they have pretty much the Virunga gorilla population in British museums. And these were all animals that were killed. They weren't like just scavenged. They were killed for this. William Hornaday, the leader of the Bronx Zoo, the first director, he went out to Borneo and caught 43 orangutans for study and for the zoo, but I don't think any made it back to New York. They all died. London Zoo had 30 orangutans at this time as well, but all of them died before 4 years passed in captivity. It's a lot about orangutans because I was only able to find this paper while I was searching to actually look at it. But and obviously, average captivity lifespan of orangutans during this time, if they made it past that whole ship trip to the place that they were going to be held captive and used as attractions for zoos and collections and curios and circuses. They live for about 18 months. So if you have animals constantly dying on you, you obviously need to keep on going back out to get more animals. And this is just a quote from this guy who also had like a circus slash zoo type situation, which is, and it's funny to sort of use him as use his quote. He was being very hypocritical, but he said that Africa is rapidly becoming impoverished because every day expeditions are coming and they're trading and they're shooting and they're capturing. And when white men come onto the scene, all the noble forms of wildlife disappear. He was really just mad because he was finding it harder to find animals for his own thing. But it's a good quote, and it's sort of showing from a person that was actually in that time, showing the kind of declines and the kind of losses that he was seeing. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Okay, I'll keep on going. So in 1900, we get this small meeting slash conference between the screenshot says Germany, Spain, King Leopold, France, Italy, Portugal, and Britain. And it was called a convention designed to ensure the conservation of various species in Africa, always in Africa, which are useful to man or inoffensive. Um, and if you notice, 1885 is when the Berlin Conference happened. So obviously they're worried about their wild animals in their colonies in Africa. So they're worried about declines. They're worried about how these animals that they either want to hunt or animals that they already know are important to the ecosystem and its structure are being killed. So they wrote up this convention and they said that we should prohibit killing vultures and giraffes and gorillas and elands, and then killing them like it was prohibited completely. So these animals were totally restricted for being killed. And then we get into a next class of animals, a next group of animals where you could kill them, but you needed to have a certain license, or you had to focus on certain ages or sexes. So for example, we have prohibiting killing young or female elephants, rhinos, hippos, buffaloes, and antelope, prohibiting unlicensed killing. And I bolded a few of these names because if you know anything about African trophy hunting, you'll know that elephants, rhinos, and buffaloes are 3 species of the big 5. So these are the animals that are basically the easiest, basically the ones that you kind of want to go after if you want to have a really good story to tell or a really interesting trophy to have at the end of your expedition. You want to have an elephant's head or tusks, or you want to have a rhino's horn or a buffalo's head, to say that you went out and killed this animal and you actually survived. And then it also encouraged the establishment of reserves, domestication of animals that were profitable, so zebras, elephants, and ostriches. Ostriches because of their feathers, obviously, and their eggs. Those were big collection items back then. And then it encouraged as well the destruction of harmful animals, which is pretty interesting when you think about conservation. So we have lions and leopards, which are the last of the big 5 game animals that trophy hunters tend to focus on. Hyenas, hunting dogs, a lot of predators, basically. And obviously they wanted to destroy these animals because they were afraid that they would be killing the animals that they actually wanted to hunt. Crocodiles as well, and pythons and poisonous snakes. They mentioned poisonous snakes for some reason. So I guess that's where inoffensive comes in. It did not get ratified though in the 1900s. They argued about some of these restrictions, I suppose, and just most of the people didn't sign it. So it was just left aside. In 1911, we have the North Pacific Fur Seal Convention, which is a convention between the United States to preserve the fur seals and other fur-bearing sea mammals like otters. And this was because they had noticed that wanting killing of these fur seals had decreased the population a lot. So they went from about 2 million, 2.5 million individuals for northern fur seals to 300,000 in 1911. And the northern fur seal has like a global distribution. So this is a huge loss. And it would have influenced a lot of countries. So it prohibited the hunting of fur seals and sea otters at sea. If you found them on the land, you could still kill them. But if you found them swimming and you were on a boat, you couldn't just shoot them in the water. And it started with a 5-year ban on a complete ban on hunting. So no country could hunt these animals for at least 5 years. And luckily, interestingly, it didn't apply to indigenous people unless, as long as they were doing it in sort of the native way, which required them to use their traditional weapons. They couldn't use firearms, or, they fell under the convention and they were breaking the law. And they also couldn't do it if they were trying to sell it to people who were sell it to outsiders, not indigenous people. And this was ratified. And then we come to the big one, the Convention Relative to the Preservation of Fauna and Flora in their Natural State, 1933. It's the London Convention of 1900, but this time it was actually ratified with a few changes. So it focused on the creation of these natural parks and strict nature reserves. And this is where we first get this idea of there being places that are completely prohibited and no people could walk in and no one can hunt. And then we have national parks, which are a little less restrictive, but still indigenous people could not come in and hunt animals in national parks. They couldn't live in national parks unless they were given permission by the colonial authorities. So it prohibited all killing of these Class A animals. Gorillas, lemurs this time show up for some reason. And it's so weird. I was looking for some information on lemurs yesterday for a totally unrelated thing. And I was trying to figure out if they were part of the exotic animal trade. And I was looking for some papers on it. I know they were, but I couldn't find any papers that gave me actual information about it. So I'm a little upset about it. But obviously there is something happening with lemurs at this time that caused them to 1933. Huh. I think I might know what was going on with lemurs at this time. So while I was looking for this information for some other thing, it turns out that France was the colonial authority for Madagascar. Madagascar is the only place you're going to find lemurs. They're endemic to the island. But France was the colonial authority, and they got power over the island in 1895. And by 1927, 70% of the forest had been cut down or converted to cash crop plantations. So that might be the reason why lemurs are on this now. Oh God, the light. That might be the reason why the lemurs are on this convention now, because lemurs require a lot of habitat, obviously. And if you have 70% of your habitat just disappear on you within 30 years, you're going to see a lot of population declines. Huh, okay. You also have killing of white rhinos, okapis, pygmy hippos, and elephants with tusks that are less than 5 kilograms each. So this is like a restriction on the kind of species that you're allowed to kill. So I'm using white-tailed deer as an example, even though I've never hunted them. I'm assuming that during hunting season, there's certain sizes of animals that you shouldn't kill, young animals. This is the same example, except for with elephants. And then it prohibited the killing of Class B animals, again, without a license. So there's different levels of restrictions. And you need a license to kill chimps, pangolins, and elephants with tusks that were larger than 5 kilograms each. So the big tuskers, as they call them. And I found this in the text of the treaty. So it says that, or the convention. So it says that no hunting other rights already possessed by native chiefs or tribes by treaty, concession, or specific agreement, or by administrative permission in the protected areas, the strict nature reserves, or the the national parks. If the colonial authorities had already recognized that the Native people had rights to hunt there, supposedly the convention shouldn't have stopped them from hunting there. So if, some governor of Namibia had found that the indigenous people were able to hunt in a place that they had later decided would be a strict nature reserve, and they had written it up and sent it to, I guess, Britain. They shouldn't have been able to be stopped from hunting in these areas, but this requires it being recognized by the authorities of the territory, which is not a thing that was happening during that time. So any questions before we move into NGOs? They were protected due to their declines.
Okay, thank you.
Other than so in 1900 we have that inoffensive or useful to man thing. So vultures, they were protected because by then people knew that vultures were important to ecosystems, cleaning up the ecosystem, dealing with the dead bodies. So those were protected. Secretary Birds, I'm not sure why. That would be interesting. Oh, Secretary Birds kill snakes, so that might be a reason why they were also protected. But for the most part, these animals are animals that people would have been focused on killing or capturing for either their own trophies or for their naturalist collections or zoos or things like that. And the thing is that this convention actually allows for zoos to keep on doing what they're doing. They just have to get permission from the colonial authorities. Anyone else have any questions? All right, so I'll continue. So I just put these little maps up because WWF and WCS are both they both work in conjunction with the Madagascar National Parks Department to help run and manage the national parks in Madagascar. So there's a lot we could go into, and I think we'll go into it in module 3, so in a couple of weeks. But there's a lot we could go into about co-managing national parks, how NGOs do that. I just thought it was interesting. So we have WWF. It's got a lot of land that it helps co-manage here in the north and across the island, basically. For WCS, there's not as many as WWF, but they do take care of this huge landscape over here in the northeast, which is the Mama Bay, Maswala Makira, and Antongil Bay landscape. And that was where I did my master's research. So I did a lot of things, and I had to go through WCS, and they also helped me with a lot of information and funding to do wildlife surveys in there. All right, so NGOs are non-governmental organizations. They're organizations independent of any government, and most of the time they are nonprofits. I like the idea of being independent of any government because if you remember, we have those companies, the Dutch East India companies, the trading companies, which were also independent of any governments, and also were focused on natural resources. NGOs are about the same thing, except this time they're focused on conserving the resources. but it's still, we'll get into it in a couple weeks. Still interesting. So they are dependent on donations and corporate sponsors. And you can see that if you are focused on donations, you're going to be focused on people who have money, which for the most part is the purview of the global north. So, for example, WCS gets a lot of money from Americans for the most part. And they get a lot of money from Americans to help protect things like lemurs in Madagascar. And so they're going to be focused on American objectives and American desires and not so much on the desires and needs of the local people. They also get corporate sponsors, which is another thing entirely that we're going to talk about. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm only going to go over two because only two that I could find actually started around late 1800s, early 1900s. So we have other NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We have the National Audubon Society, we have the National Wildlife Federation, we have Sierra Club. And we could talk about that, but I kind of want to focus on these NGOs that are more international, since this is supposed to be a global conservation and natural resource management class. And I assume you guys learn about those NGOs in your wildlife management classes. Yeah, hopefully you guys do. I could say a lot about Sierra Club, but it is what it is. So we have the Wildlife Conservation Society, which was originally the New York Zoological Society, founded in 1895. Here is a picture of their first annual report. And they were largely focused on making a zoo first that would sort of showcase all of the native North American animals and sort of inspire interest in zoology as a science, and also in animals and North American animals in particular. So they were focused mainly on North America at first, but in later years, especially after colonization ended and a lot of countries gained their independence, you see them start reaching their fingers out across the seas and becoming more involved in international things. So founders, we have Andrew Green, let me see, I'm trying to remember what I read about him. Yeah, okay. Andrew Green, he might have been a sugarcane plantation overseer in one of the Caribbean islands when he was a young man. Henry F. Osborne and Madison Grant, they were both eugenicists. Madison Grant was the worst one, but they were both interested in eugenics and were pretty sure that it was the way of the future. All of them were racist, depending on the intensity of things. William Hornaday, we have him, if you remember a little bit back on the lecture, he was the one who was catching 43 orangutans in Borneo. He was the first director of the Bronx Zoo, which is the zoo that they created and is where WCS is based out of. But he was the director when Oda Benga was held captive in the zoo. And yeah, okay. Actually, so hopefully you guys didn't get out of Top Hat. Because I got this little thingy. Hopefully you guys see that. So I wish I had edited it before class. I forgot. I wanted to know, have you guys ever heard of Otobenga before this class? And in particular, before like last year? And if so, then where? Me, I had never heard of them until last year. I think WCS like apologized for it, and then that's when I heard of it. So it was pretty crazy, pretty wild. So we're gonna watch this video about him. And the thing is that so there is another documentary on YouTube. It's called Human Zoos. You can look it up. It's free. It's right there on YouTube. But it's an hour, and I couldn't make you guys watch another video for an hour. I felt like I actually had to teach. So let me see. Hold on, let me turn this up actually first so I can hear it. So we're gonna watch this video.
Standing in the corner of a cage in the monkey house was not an animal, but a young man dressed in
All right. So we have the last NGO that I'm going to be talking about today, which is Fauna and Flora International. Its logo is a little oryx because they had a project to help preserve and conserve some species of oryx. I think it might have been Arabian, and they ended up actually breeding it back to a good enough population level that it didn't need to be like held captive, sort of like a California condor situation. But it started as the Society of the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire in 1903. Its main founder was Edward North Buxton, who was a huge game hunter, and he was particularly worried about the decline of the huntable species in Africa. He said that game was a precious inheritance of the empire and something to be guarded, something like a very rare picture. And there was a lot of debate within the society. There were many men that were a part of the society, very well-connected men, rich men. But there was a debate about Native rights to hunt in the society. Some people thought that they should be allowed to hunt. For example, Buxton actually believed that Native people should be allowed to hunt as long as they didn't have any firearms. Again, we have that whole idea of them modernizing and not being Native anymore, I suppose. And then there were other people who thought that they shouldn't be allowed to hunt at all. So there was a lot of debate within society itself. Oh, yes, but they so as I mentioned, they were well connected, rich white men. They had connections with Hornaday and the Bronx Zoo, and they also had connections with a lot of people that were basically running the preserves or trying to create preserves in Africa. So they ended up pushing for certain areas to be protected, and Kruger National Park in South Africa was one of their achievements, I guess you would say. Kruger National Park obviously was put on land that was taken from indigenous Africans. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that in this class anymore, but yeah, just so you guys know. And there's a lot of issues with Kruger National Park today, a lot of huge issues. But okay, so takeaway points. We got again concerns of overexploitation, which began early, but there wasn't a lot of action done. There wasn't like a tipping point until around the 1800s. And naturalists and zoos had a share in these declines in populations, particularly of wildlife. We have protected areas and these preservation conventions, which were largely motivated by utilitarian purposes. So we have the two London conventions which were focused on huntable game or inoffensive to man vultures, which were key to ecosystem running. We also have the Northern Fur Pacific Seal Convention in 1911, which was focused on the fact that these fur seals that they were using and these other fur-bearing sea mammals that they were hunting were declining because people were hunting them so wildly. And then we have, again, indigenous people were displaced or decimated in effort to protect these empires, game and resources. Native rights to the natural resources were debated. Some people felt that they had rights to hunt in these areas, but usually as long as they didn't have access to modern weapons. And then some people thought they didn't have any rights at all. So, and that is the end of this lecture.